She was just a 16-year-old girl living alone, near the pines. But what Clara May did that morning would bring a forgotten tribe of warriors down from the ridges for the first time in generations, walking silent through the valley, not for war, but for debt. Folks say it's legend. But I saw the trail of blood myself stretching like a scar across the earth. And I heard the stone drums echoing off the cliffs, drums the old ones called thank yous, never spoken aloud. That morning, Clara didn't set out to make history. She just meant to fetch water. But when she found a dying man, crumpled by the creek blood seeping into the moss, an arrow still buried in his shoulder, she knew one thing: if she walked away, he would die. And if she didn't, the world around her would never be the same again. They say the valley is quiet before dawn, that it holds its breath just a moment before the sun stretches over the ridgeline. But that morning, the silence was broken by a sound Clara May would never forget. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the cracking of a falling limb or the call of some restless bird. It was sharper, meaner. A gunshot, short and ugly, riding the mist like a curse. Clara stood barefoot in the doorway of her mother's old cabin, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her eyes narrowing against the gray morning light. At 16, she knew the difference between the sounds of the forest and the sounds of trouble. She waited, heart still, breath held. Then it came again, closer this time. A second shot followed by the unmistakable silence of something or someone falling hard into the earth. That was all she needed to hear. She stepped back inside and grabbed her knife and slung the canteen over her shoulder. The woods below the ridge were still wet from the night's drizzle, leaves slick, and the moss-covered stones treacherous. But Clara moved like someone born to the land, quiet, sure-footed, and alert. She didn't make a sound. As she passed the birch grove, her fingers brushing the bark like it might speak to her. And when she reached the bend in the creek, the one shaped like a sickle, she saw it. Blood. Dark, fresh, and pooling into the roots of an old oak. Her eyes followed the trail, and then she saw him. He lay twisted beside the water, his back against the rocks, one arm curled protectively across his chest. His clothes were soaked through, and not just from the creek. A black feathered arrow jutted from his shoulder, and another wound, smaller but deeper, leaked red into the mud near his ribs. He looked older than her father had been when he died, but not by much. His face was drawn with pain, skin flushed, lips a pale. He was native, no doubt about that. But Clara didn't see a threat. She saw a man on the edge of death, and no one coming to help. She crouched beside him, her knife still clutched in one hand, the other reaching slowly toward his face. His eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment, dark and alert despite the blood. And in that instant, she knew two things. One, this man had been hunted. Two, if she left him here, he'd be gone before the sun finished rising. Her breath came slow. She looked at the creek running cold and fast, separating her cabin from where they now stood. Then she looked at him again. And just like that, she made the choice no one in town would have dared. She sheathed her knife, slipped an arm under his, and whispered, "Don't die yet. I ain't finished deciding who you are." Clara didn't know it then, but that step across mud, blood, and fear wasn't just the beginning of a rescue. It was the first thread in a weave that would pull warriors from hiding, awaken an old truth, and challenge every line that had been drawn between settler and native for generations. Clara had dragged him halfway across the rocky bank before her arms began to tremble. The man was heavier than he looked, not from fat, but the kind of weight that comes with a life lived hard. Every breath he took was shallow and wet, the kind of sound that makes a body flinch just to hear it. But Clara didn't stop. Her boots slipped in the wet grass, her braid came loose, and her legs were scratched raw from the reeds, but she didn't stop. When they finally reached her cabin, the sky was bleeding pink behind the trees. She pulled him inside, laid him down by the hearth, and stoked the coals to life. The fire fought her at first, as if reluctant to warm a stranger. But soon the dry twigs caught, and light flickered across the cabin walls, illuminating the man's weathered face. He was still unconscious, skin-clammy shirt stuck to him with a mix of sweat and blood. Clara knelt beside him and began to cut away the soaked fabric, careful not to jar the arrow, still lodged deep in his shoulder. She boiled water, tore strips from her old petticoat, and did her best to clean the wounds. Her hands shook not from fear of him, but from the realization that she didn't know what she was doing. Her mama had passed before she could teach Clara how to stitch skin or treat a wound this deep. But Clara knew how to be gentle. And sometimes that counted more than knowledge. She cleaned, wrapped, and whispered to him softly, even though she doubted he could hear. Outside, the bloodgrass swayed in the morning wind, tall stalks that turned crimson in the fall, now stained deeper with what had spilled that day. Clara stood at the window, her eyes scanning the distant trees. Someone had done this to him, and someone might come back to finish it. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was friend or threat. But her gut told her the truth. No one sends an arrow like that unless they've got something to hide. And as the fire crackled low, and the stranger's breath grew steadier, Clara realized something else. If she was going to keep this man alive, she'd have to protect him not just from the wounds on his body, but from the lies waiting outside her door. Lies dressed up as law, wrapped in flags, held in white knuckles gripping rifles. She poured herself a tin of coffee, sat by the door, and waited for morning to show its full face. Because once the town got wind of what she'd done, there'd be no taking it back. And you, dear listener, what would you have done in her place? Would you have turned your back, or would you have stepped across the line, knowing full well the cost? By the time the sun lifted over the pines, Clara had already boiled more water, changed the man's bandages, and prayed 3 separate prayers, none of which she was certain anyone was listening to. The stranger had stirred once in the night, mumbling something in a language she didn't know, before slipping back into fevered sleep. He was burning now, not just from wounds, but from whatever poison his body was fighting inside. She did what she could, cool cloth to the brow broth, made thin from squirrel stock, and the steady rhythm of someone simply staying. But outside her walls, the valley was beginning to wake up, and it didn't take long for the whispers to start. First came Johnny Carter, the trapper, stopping by with a jug of milk and a dozen questions. Said he'd heard gunfire the morning before. Said he saw tracks near the bloodgrass patch. Clara smiled politely, told him she'd heard coyotes, nothing more. But the way his eyes lingered on the smoke from her chimney said he didn't believe a word of it. By mid-afternoon, the trading post was buzzing. Someone claimed they'd seen Clara dragging something through the trees. Others said she was hiding a wounded wolf, or maybe worse, harboring one of them. That word came with weight. It always had. One of them didn't need a name, a face, or a crime. All it needed was skin darker than cotton and a reason for folks to be afraid. And fear, Clara knew, was the easiest kind of fire to light. Silas Vane, the loudest voice in town, fanned the embers into full flame. Tall, sharp-jawed, and self-righteous as a preacher with a badge, he stood on the porch of the general store, warning folks about native infiltration and the dangers of weak hearts inviting war. He didn't name Clara, not yet. But he didn't have to. Everyone in town knew she lived alone near the ridge. And folks in towns like theirs didn't need proof. Just a reason. Back in the cabin, Clara listened to the wind press against the shutters like it carried every whisper spoken down below. She didn't regret her choice, not for a second, but she could feel the weight of it now. The stranger hadn't spoken again, but his fever was climbing. Whatever strength he'd once had was fading by the hour. And Clara, who'd never turned away from a wounded bird or broken fence post, now found herself standing between a dying man and a town ready to judge. She sat by the fire blade beside her heart, heavier than the mountains outside. She didn't know who would come first, Silas with his accusations, or the stranger's past with its blood-stained hands. But either way, morning would bring more than coffee and chores. The fever finally broke just before dawn. Clara had dozed off in the rocking chair, boots still on knife resting across her lap. A low groan stirred her awake, quiet, gravelly, like a man trying to speak after years of silence. She rose slowly, cautious but calm, and knelt beside him. His eyes were open now, dark clear and no longer glazed with fever. He stared at the rafters for a long while before turning his head toward her. "What's your name?" she asked, softly voice, more comfort than question. The man blinked once, as if the answer was buried too deep to reach. Then he shook his head slightly. Don't know, he rasped. Used to. Can't now. Clara nodded, not pressing him further. She offered a sip of water, which he took in small, painful swallows. When he spoke again, it was fragmented, half English, half a language she didn't understand. But a few words slipped through clearly enough. Ridge. Betrayed? Map? Wrong men? Clara leaned closer, catching pieces like stones in a stream. He'd been part of something, some meeting, a discussion that went bad. He mentioned Red Tree, which Clara recognized as the name of an old tribal group said to have vanished years ago. He said they were trying to protect land, sacred land, and someone had turned on them. Names came and went, most meaningless to Clara, but one made her chest tighten vain. Silas. Clara sat back slowly, the pieces beginning to fit in ways she hadn't expected. The man lying in her cabin wasn't just some wounded traveler. He was a witness, maybe even a target. And the men who put that arrow in his shoulder? They hadn't missed by accident. They'd meant to erase him and whatever knowledge he carried before it reached the wrong ears. She rose to fetch the bundle of belongings he'd carried when she first found him, mud-soaked and half-torn. Inside, tucked within a weathered leather pouch, she found it a folded hide marked with faded ink and unfamiliar symbols. It was a map, but not like any she'd seen in school or at the trading post. This one traced old rivers, sacred paths, boundaries no settler's hand had drawn. It was without question a map of native land annotated with markers and warnings. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she traced one line labeled Ash Ridge, a place her mother once warned her never to go. The man stirred again, voice raw but urgent. "Don't let them take it," he whispered. "Not again." Clara looked down at him, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. This wasn't just about hiding a stranger. She was now the keeper of a truth men had tried to bury under bullets and blame. And that truth, fragile as it was, might just be the spark that lights everything on fire. Night came early, as it often did in the valley during October, and with it came a chill that slipped through every crack in the cabin's walls. Clara had spent the day trying to make sense of the map, listening to the stranger's broken words and watching the ridgeline through the window with growing unease. He drifted in and out of sleep, sweating and muttering names that made her blood run cold. Names tied to the town, names that didn't belong in a dying man's mouth. She hadn't lit the lantern, only the fire burned now, low and steady, casting long shadows across the log walls like the memory of someone pacing. Clara sat near it with the map open on the floor, her fingers tracing the inked lines again and again. Each turn in the creek, each jagged edge of drawn mountain seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't yet understand. And then, just after midnight, she saw it. A flicker of orange, then another. Not firelight from a chimney, not lightning, torches. She moved to the window silently, her breath catching in her throat. Down by the bloodgrass near the bend in the creek were riders. 4, maybe 5, moving slow, talking low. One of them dismounted and knelt by something, probably the place where Clara had found the man bleeding days ago. They were looking for something, or someone, and they were close. The man stirred behind her. Clara turned and placed a finger gently to her lips. He nodded faintly. There was no fear in his eyes now, only resignation, like he'd expected this moment from the first time he opened them in her home. Clara grabbed her knife, pulled on her coat, and motioned for him to rise. He tried, groaned, then pressed his weight against the wall and stood. Barely. They slipped out the back through the thicket of bramble that led to the hollow her mother used to call Fox Shade. The moon overhead was thin, barely enough to see by, but Clara knew every root and rock by heart. Behind them, the sounds grew sharper, footsteps, snapping twigs, voices now low, but drawing closer. She didn't speak. There wasn't time, just breath and movement. One step, then another. At the edge of the hollow, they paused. The man leaned heavy against her shoulder, whispering one word, map. She handed it to him, rolled tight in oilcloth. He tucked it beneath his coat like it was part of him. They moved again, vanishing into the brush, just as a beam of torchlight swept across the trail where they'd stood moments before. Clara looked back once. The men had stopped. One of them raised a torch toward her cabin, the flame curling into the night. And in that moment, she knew they hadn't come to find him. They'd come to erase him. By morning, there'd be more. Boots in the dirt, questions with loaded meaning, and Clara's name whispered like a threat through every doorway in town. But first, they had to survive the night. By morning, the forest was still again. Birds had returned to the trees, and the wind whispered through the dry branches like nothing had happened. But Clara knew better. She and the wounded man had found shelter in an old trapper's cave near the upper ridge, a place long abandoned, half covered in moss, and dry enough to wait out the dark. They hadn't slept, not really. The stranger had drifted in and out of shallow breathing, but Clara had stayed awake, her back against the stone, the knife resting across her lap. She kept her eyes on the narrow mouth of the cave, but her thoughts turned inward toward the hide-wrapped bundle the man kept pressed to his chest, like it was his final breath. When he finally stirred again just past first light, he placed it gently in her hands. No words, just a slow nod. Clara waited until he was still again, then peeled back the weathered leather and unrolled the hide across her lap. What she saw wasn't a map in the way she understood maps. There were no town names, no railroads, no English words. Just rivers, mountains, and circles, some filled with color, others marked with slashes or hand-carved symbols. Lines curved in ways that didn't match any settler's chart. But when Clara looked closer, she saw it beneath the worn edges. Faded, but still legible, were boundaries. Not drawn by surveyors, but passed down. Tribal, generational, sacred. And then she saw something that made her breath catch. One of the circles, marked with a spiral and a red dot, sat directly where Cedar Bluff stood today. Her town. The place she'd been raised, where her parents had traded and prayed and tried to belong. But here on this map, it wasn't a town at all. It was a burial ground, once protected by treaty, then claimed, paved over, and forgotten. Clara traced the spiral with one trembling finger, her throat dry. The truth hit her like a winter gust. The man beside her had likely once been a guardian of this land. And now the map he carried, this fragile hide, inked by hand, was not only proof of what was lost, but of what had been taken. She rolled the hide back carefully, pressing it close to her chest. The man opened one eye and met her gaze. "It's why they hunt," he said, his voice cracked and hoarse. "Not just me, what I carry." Clara nodded slowly. This wasn't about guilt or sympathy anymore. It was about responsibility. And if the men down in town were willing to kill to keep this buried, then Clara had to decide whether she'd be one more girl who stayed quiet, or the one who finally spoke. Clara didn't speak for a long time after she rolled the map back into its worn leather wrap. The morning sun filtered through the brush outside the cave, casting gold onto the stone walls, warm and soft, but it felt like a cruel contrast to the cold weight sitting in her chest. She looked at the man beside her, breathing slow but steady, and knew with a quiet certainty that he'd risked his life not to escape, but to deliver something. Something no one else wanted to carry. And now that burden had fallen to her. She pulled her knees close and stared into the dirt floor, her thoughts drifting to her father's old rocking chair on the front porch, to the Bible verses her mother used to sew into the lining of her dresses, and to the graves behind the cabin, where both of them now rested, without ever knowing they'd built their life on sacred bones. That thought burned. Not just the ignorance, but the unwillingness of everyone in town to look beyond their own comfort, their own stories. Clara had heard the old rumors about Indian land treaties and bad deals, but they were always brushed off, too far gone, too complicated, too inconvenient to fix. But this wasn't some ghost story anymore. It was breathing beside her. It had bled in her hands. She stood slowly, her legs stiff from crouching too long, and stepped just outside the cave entrance. The air was cool and clean. A hawk circled overhead. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let the wind press against her like a mother's hand. Then she whispered, Not loud, not proud, just firm. I won't be quiet. It wasn't a speech. Wasn't meant for the newspapers or church pews or the men at the trading post. It was just a promise offered to the land, to the ancestors she'd never known, and to the man behind her who had nearly died for a truth no one wanted unearthed. She'd carry it now. Not because she had to, but because no one else would. She turned back, saw him watching her with tired but knowing eyes. There was something like relief in them, something like trust. And in that moment, Clara May, the orphan girl by the ridge daughter of forgotten farmers, became something new. She became accountable. By sundown, they would have to move again. The men with torches hadn't given up. But now, Clara had more than a secret. She had a mission. They left the cave just before dusk, walking slow but steady toward the southern trail where the hills opened like cupped hands toward the deeper woods. Clara helped him along the map, hidden tight in her saddlebag, wrapped in the same cloth her mother once used to line the kitchen table. The man spoke little, saving what strength he had, but now and then he'd glance toward the ridge line, eyes narrowing like he was remembering old roads the world had tried to erase. There was tension in the air, not the kind that came before a storm, but the kind that came before a reckoning. By nightfall, they reached a clearing filled with strange markings. Stones arranged in tight spirals, animal bones hung from branches in quiet reverence. Clara paused at the edge, unsure, but the man gestured forward. "Red tree," he whispered. "Old circle. They'll come." He sat heavily against a tree trunk, sweat beading on his brow. His strength was fading again, but his eyes burned with something fierce hope. They waited. The fire Clara built was small, meant more for signal than warmth. She sat cross-legged in the dirt, eyes fixed on the darkened tree line, heart beating slow but strong. And then, just past midnight, they came. Silent, unannounced. Figures emerged from the brush like ghosts made of ash and leather. Faces painted with red across the cheeks, feathers woven into braids, and spears in hand, not raised, not threatening, just present. Watchful. The red tree hadn't vanished. They had simply gone where the world wouldn't look. An older woman stepped forward, hair gray as frost, her gaze scanning Clara with unsettling calm. She said something in her own tongue, and the man beside Clara replied weakly, using the same language Clara had only ever heard in fragments. The exchange was short, measured. Then the woman turned to Clara, studied her face a long moment, and said in accented English, "You carry what does not belong to you, but you did not take it. That matters." Clara stood taller. "I only want to see it protected." The woman nodded once. "Then you must know this map does more than tell the past. It reveals what's coming." She turned and whistled once, sharp as a hawk's cry. More figures stepped from the shadows, including one young man carrying a bundle wrapped in the same hide as the map. They laid it on the ground between them and unrolled it, a second map, more recent, more precise. And Clara understood. The red tree hadn't just preserved old knowledge. They had been watching marking railroad expansions, land claims, and every betrayal inked into county ledgers. And now they were ready to act. Clara looked at the man beside her, his face lit faintly by the fire. He nodded. She knew what that meant. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just be a girl with a secret. She'd be standing with a nation. They reached the creek just after sunrise. The water still flowed the same as it had days before, babbling over smooth stones and catching the morning light like strands of silver. But something had changed. Clara stood at the edge now, not as a lost girl looking for answers, but as a bridge between two truths, one that had been erased and one that had been believed too easily. The stranger beside her, wrapped in blankets and steadied by two red tree scouts, looked to the far bank and exhaled slow, like he was home again. The place felt smaller than Clara remembered. The same wild rose bushes still clung to the western slope. The same cottonwoods leaned toward the bend, but now it all pulsed with meaning. This wasn't just where she had found him. It was where history had bled into the present, where someone else's past had spilled into her quiet life, uninvited, and refused to be ignored. The red tree woman, the elder with the frost-gray hair, stepped forward and knelt beside the creek. She dipped her hand into the water, let it run through her fingers, and spoke a few words in her language. Then she looked at Clara. "Here is where blood was taken," she said softly, "and where truth must begin again." Clara nodded, her heart steady now. The map was no longer just a relic, it was a compass. And the plan was simple: return to Cedar Bluff, not with torches, not with war, but with presence, with names, with land deeds that had been hidden, with witnesses who still remembered when the ink dried on promises never kept. The scouts set up a small camp near the creek's bend. Smoke curled gently into the air as pots boiled over low flames. One of them carved symbols into bark, another unpacked a bundle of folded paper copies of the original map, made by hand to be handed to those who would listen. And Clara sat beneath the old cottonwood writing a letter. It was to be given to Silas Vane before they entered town. Not to plead, but to warn. She would not come quietly. By mid-afternoon, the stranger slept again, his body still recovering, though his spirit seemed stronger with each passing mile. Clara stood watch over him in the camp. The water whispered at her feet. The wind stirred through the tall grass. And somewhere in the distance, the bells of Cedar Bluff's church began to ring, just faint enough to feel like an omen. She didn't flinch. Not anymore. Tomorrow she would return. Cedar Bluff didn't burn that day. It listened. Not because the townsfolk were saints, or because they suddenly found compassion in their bones, but because Clara didn't walk in with rage. She walked in with the truth. And behind her, flanking her silently, were 12 members of the Red Tree. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply stood and were seen. Clara spoke in the church square voice, even and low, like her father used to speak over scripture. She unrolled the map slowly, careful not to tear its edges, and laid it across the steps where sermons had once been shouted about conquest and blessing. She read from her letter. Not just about the land, but about the silence. About what it cost to look away. About what it meant to belong to a land, to a story, to each other. Some turned their faces, some muttered. But others listened. In essence, Silas Vane never approached her directly. But he stood in the back hat in hand, eyes shadowed with something she couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or fear, or the beginning of understanding. They didn't tear the town apart. No borders were redrawn that morning, but something small shifted like ice cracking on a thawing river, enough to let sunlight in. By sundown, Clara had walked the stranger back to the creek. He leaned against the old cottonwood, breathing easier now, the fever finally broken. He looked at her with something like reverence. Not gratitude, no, something deeper. A recognition that they were now bound not by blood, but by the choice to stand. The Red Tree offered her a place, a role, a name, not as a guest, as kin. Clara didn't answer right away. She sat by the water where it all began, boots muddy, heart full, and stared at the way the creek caught the last light of day. She was no longer just a settler's daughter, no longer just a girl who'd stumbled into something bigger than herself. She was something new, something rare, a daughter of two nations. The story didn't end that night. Truth doesn't end. It walks beside us, whispering in creek beds and pine winds, waiting for someone brave enough to carry it a little farther. And maybe that someone is you. If you were Clara faced with history, honor, and danger, would you have stood your ground? Let us know in the comments below. And if stories like this still stir something inside you, something old and good, click subscribe. Because the West still has stories to tell, and the next one might begin just over the ridge.